Title: Why Do Humans Turn Evil? In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo transformed the basement of Stanford University into a mock prison. He divided ordinary college students into guards and prisoners, planning to study their behavior for 2 weeks. The experiment lasted 6 days. Within that time, the guards had become sadistic torturers, and the prisoners had descended into learned helplessness and psychological breakdown. Years later, Zimbardo would ask the question that haunts us still: what makes good people do evil things? We prefer to believe that evil is something foreign to us, that it belongs to monsters, psychopaths, historical villains safely contained in the past. We draw clear lines between ourselves and them, the Nazis, the slavers, the genociders, convinced that we could never do what they did. This is a comforting lie. The uncomfortable truth is that evil is not an aberration but a potential, dormant in every human heart, waiting for the right circumstances to awaken. History is not a story of good people and bad people. It is a story of ordinary human beings who, under certain conditions, commit acts of unthinkable cruelty while maintaining that they are righteous, necessary, even virtuous. The inquisitors believed they were saving souls. The colonizers believed they were civilizing savages. The revolutionaries believed they were creating paradise. Each convinced themselves that their atrocities served a higher purpose. Friedrich Nietzsche warned us, beware that, when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you. We have been gazing into the abyss of human evil for centuries, trying to understand it, to explain it, to prevent it. But we have been looking in the wrong direction. The abyss is not out there in the world. It is within us, waiting. Why do humans turn evil? Because we are human. And to understand this is not to excuse it, but to recognize the shadow we all carry and the terrible ease with which it can possess us. The word evil derives from the Old English ifel, meaning bad, wicked, or morally wrong. But this etymology tells us little. What constitutes wickedness? Who decides what is morally wrong? History shows us that one era's virtue is another's atrocity. The Aztecs believed human sacrifice was necessary to prevent the sun from dying. Medieval Christians believed burning heretics saved them from eternal damnation. Every perpetrator of evil has believed, in some fashion, that they were doing right. Carl Jung spent his life studying what he called the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we find unacceptable and repress into the unconscious. The shadow contains not only our petty faults and shameful desires, but also our capacity for cruelty, violence, and destruction. We split off these qualities, project them onto others, and declare them foreign to our nature. But Jung insisted that this splitting is precisely what makes us dangerous. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. When we deny our own capacity for evil, we do not eliminate it. We merely ensure that when it emerges, and it will emerge, it does so unconsciously, explosively, justified by elaborate rationalizations that prevent us from recognizing what we have become. The man who insists he could never harm another is often the one who, under pressure, commits acts of shocking brutality while telling himself it is necessary, justified, even noble." In Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan Karamazov delivers his famous poem about the Grand Inquisitor. In it, Christ returns during the Spanish Inquisition and is arrested by the Inquisitor, who tells him, "We have corrected your work." The Inquisitor explains that humanity cannot bear the terrible freedom Christ offered them. They want security, bread, authority, not liberty. So the Church has taken upon itself the burden of enslaving humanity for its own good, burning those who would disturb this comfortable tyranny. The Grand Inquisitor is not a simple villain. He believes sincerely that his cruelty serves compassion, that his lies protect a necessary truth, that freedom is too dangerous to be permitted. This is the psychology of every authoritarian regime, every totalitarian ideology, every system that commits evil in the name of good. They are saving us from ourselves, protecting order against chaos, preserving civilization against barbarism. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Hannah Arendt, covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann, expected to encounter a monster. Instead, she found a banal bureaucrat, a man of ordinary intelligence and conventional morality who had orchestrated the transportation of millions to death camps while viewing himself as a dutiful civil servant following orders. She coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe this phenomenon. Evil does not require sadistic pleasure or demonic motivation. It requires only thoughtlessness, the abdication of personal judgment, the willingness to surrender moral responsibility to external authority. Eichmann repeatedly stated that he was simply doing his job, following the law, serving his country. He seemed genuinely unable to comprehend that legality and morality might diverge. When asked if he felt guilt, he responded that he would have felt guilty if he had not done what he did, if he had failed in his duty. His conscience was not absent, it was inverted. This is the terrible truth Arendt uncovered. Evil can be committed by people who never question, who never think deeply about their actions, who follow the path of least resistance within systems designed to normalize atrocity. Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments demonstrated this with chilling clarity. Ordinary people, told by an authority figure in a lab coat to administer what they believed were dangerous electric shocks to another person, complied at alarming rates, despite hearing screams, despite pleading from the victim, despite their own moral discomfort. 65% delivered what they thought were potentially lethal shocks, simply because a scientist told them to continue. They did not want to. They protested, but they obeyed. Milgram concluded, ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. The participants were not sadists. They were normal people placed in a situation where defying authority felt more difficult than inflicting harm. This is how genocide happens. This is how torture becomes policy. This is how evil spreads not through the actions of monsters, but through the compliance of ordinary people who suppress their own moral intuition in deference to external pressure. In Lord of the Flies, William Golding strips away civilization to reveal what he believed lay beneath, a capacity for savagery that emerges the moment social constraints are removed. British schoolboys, stranded on an island, descend into tribalism, violence, and murder. The novel suggests that evil is not learned but inherent, that civilization is a thin veneer barely containing our primal brutality. But this view is too simple. The anthropologist Margaret Mead studied societies where violence was rare, where cooperation dominated competition, where gentleness was the norm. Clearly, human nature is not fixed but malleable, shaped by culture, circumstance, and choice. We are born with a capacity for both shan, compassion, and cruelty. Which one flourishes depends on the soil in which we are planted. Psychologist Albert Bandura identified moral disengagement as the mechanism through which good people commit evil acts. We employ euphemistic labeling, enhanced interrogation instead of torture, collateral damage instead of murdered civilians. We displace responsibility, I was following orders. We dehumanize victims, they are cockroaches, vermin, savages, not truly human. We reconstruct conduct, what we do is defensive, necessary, unavoidable. Through these cognitive tricks, we silence the voice of conscience and proceed with actions we would otherwise find abhorrent. Evil requires disconnection from our own moral sense, from empathy with victims, from awareness of consequences, from the recognition of our shared humanity. The more we can create distance, physical, emotional, conceptual, the easier it becomes to harm others. Jung observed that the greatest danger facing humanity was not external threats, but our own unconsciousness. He watched in horror as Germany, one of the most cultured and educated nations in Europe, descended into barbarism. How could the land of Goethe and Beethoven produce the Third Reich? The answer lay not in German exceptionalism, but in a collective shadow that had never been acknowledged. The more a culture proclaims its enlightenment, the darker the shadow it casts. The Nazis did not see themselves as evil. They believed they were purifying the world, creating a new order, fulfilling destiny. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, gave speeches to his SS officers about the difficult task they bore, the moral burden of having to exterminate populations for the greater good. He praised them for remaining decent while doing hard and necessary work. This rhetoric of noble sacrifice while committing atrocity is a hallmark of ideological evil. Ideology is perhaps the most efficient engine for transforming humans into instruments of evil. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, documenting the horrors of the Soviet Gulag, wrote, "The imagination and the spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses, because they had no ideology. Ideology provides a totalizing worldview that justifies any action in service of its vision. It splits the world into good and evil, us and them, the enlightened and the enemies of progress. Once you accept its premises, atrocity becomes not only permissible but obligatory." During the Rwandan genocide, Hutu neighbors murdered Tutsi neighbors with whom they had lived peacefully for decades. Radio broadcasts and propaganda had convinced them that Tutsis were Inyenzi cockroaches, that exterminating them was self-defense against an existential threat. Within 100 days, approximately 800,000 people were slaughtered, often with machetes, in close personal violence. Those who killed were not psychopaths. They were ordinary farmers, teachers, clergy. They had been convinced that murder was duty. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote that evil is monotonous. It repeats the same patterns across cultures and centuries because it exploits the same vulnerabilities in human psychology: tribalism, obedience to authority, susceptibility to propaganda, the desire to belong, the fear of exclusion, the comfort of certainty, the intoxication of righteousness. We are tribal creatures. Evolution wired us to distinguish between in-group and out-group, to trust our own and suspect outsiders. This served survival in small hunter-gatherer bands, but in mass societies, tribalism becomes weaponized. Political parties, religions, nations, ethnicities, any identity can become the basis for division. Once we define others as fundamentally different, as threatening, as less than human, violence follows with terrible inevitability. Social psychologist Muzaffer Sharif demonstrated this with the Robbers Cave experiment. He took well-adjusted boys to a summer camp and divided them into two groups. Within days of competitive activities, the groups developed intense hostility, engaging in raids, vandalism, and fights. The boys were identical in background and temperament. The only difference was group membership. Yet this arbitrary division was sufficient to generate genuine hatred. The same mechanism operates in genocide, ethnic cleansing, religious persecution, political violence. We need only a category, a label, a way to distinguish us from them. The rest follows with horrifying predictability: stereotyping, scapegoating, dehumanization, violence. And those who participate often describe a strange exhilaration, a sense of purpose and belonging that comes from joining the collective in opposition to a designated enemy. In his memoir, Ordinary Men, Christopher Browning documents Reserve Police Battalion 101 middle-aged German men too old for combat who were assigned to execute Jewish civilians in Poland. These were not Nazi ideologues or SS fanatics. They were ordinary working-class men, many of whom initially found the task distressing. Yet, over time, most participated in mass executions. Those who refused were not punished, they were simply assigned other duties. The pressure to conform, to not let down one's comrades, to avoid being seen as weak, this social pressure was sufficient to turn ordinary men into killers. Browning's conclusion is chilling. If the men of Reserve Police Battalion 101 could become killers under such circumstances, what group of men cannot? We would like to believe that we are different, that we would refuse, that we possess special moral courage that would enable us to resist, but the evidence suggests otherwise. Most people, in most circumstances, conform. Erich Fromm argued that humans face a fundamental existential dilemma. We are conscious of our own existence, aware of our mortality, capable of imagining alternatives to our condition. This awareness brings terrible freedom and terrible loneliness. To escape this unbearable freedom, we submit to authority, embrace conformity, merge our identity with collectives. We practice what Fromm called the escape from freedom, surrendering autonomy to avoid the anxiety of self-determination. Totalitarian systems exploit this tendency. They offer certainty, purpose, belonging, and absolution from personal responsibility. Follow the leader, obey the ideology, serve the collective, and you will be free from doubt, free from guilt, free from the burden of thinking for yourself. This is seductive. Hannah Arendt noted that the appeal of totalitarianism lay not in promising happiness, but in offering escape from the chaos and meaninglessness of modern life. Dostoevsky explored this theme in Notes from Underground, where the underground man rejects the crystal palace of rational utopia precisely because it would eliminate freedom. He insists on his right to act against his own self-interest, to choose suffering over programmed happiness, to assert his individual will against systematic optimization. This perverse resistance contains a profound truth. Humans will embrace irrationality, even self-destruction, rather than become mere cogs in a system, however benevolent. Yet this same impulse can lead to nihilism, to the rejection of all values, to the belief that since there is no objective meaning, anything is permitted. Ivan Karamazov declares, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. Without transcendent moral authority, what prevents us from doing whatever we desire? Nietzsche understood this danger. When he proclaimed God is dead, he was not celebrating but warning. The death of God meant the collapse of the moral framework that had structured Western civilization. Nietzsche's answer was the Übermensch, the individual who creates values rather than inheriting them, who takes responsibility for meaning in a meaningless universe. But this requires extraordinary psychological strength. Most people cannot bear this burden. Instead, they fall into what Nietzsche called resentment, a poisonous resentment of life itself, a desire to drag down anything higher, to punish existence for its indifference. This resentment, he argued, was the hidden motive behind much that called itself morality. The Columbine shooters left behind writings revealing not mindless rage, but elaborate philosophical justifications. They saw themselves as superior beings taking revenge on an inferior world that had rejected them. School shooters, terrorists, mass murderers, many share this grandiose narrative of themselves as agents of cosmic justice, punishing a guilty world. Their evil feels, to them, like righteousness. Jung wrote that the shadow is 90% gold. Hidden in what we reject about ourselves is not only our capacity for destruction, but also our potential for transformation. The same psychological energy that can turn toward evil can turn toward creation. Aggression can become assertion. Rage can become passion for justice. The will to power can become the will to self-overcoming. This is why confronting the shadow is essential. We must acknowledge our capacity for evil, not to indulge it, but to integrate it consciously. The person who insists, "I could never do that," is precisely the one most vulnerable to possession by destructive forces. The person who admits, "I contain this potential," gains the ability to channel it, to transform it, to choose consciously rather than act unconsciously. Solzhenitsyn, reflecting on his experiences in the Gulag, wrote perhaps the most important sentence about evil ever composed. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. We are not divided into good people and evil people. Each of us contains both. The question is not whether we have darkness within us, we do. The question is whether we will acknowledge it, integrate it, and choose consciously how we live. In The Lucifer Effect, Zimbardo concludes that evil is not about bad apples, but bad barrels. Situations, systems, and institutions can transform ordinary people into perpetrators of cruelty, but this does not absolve us of responsibility. We create the systems. We participate in the institutions. We consent to the situations. At every moment, we have the capacity to say no, to resist, to refuse complicity. The Danish resistance during World War II demonstrated this possibility. When the Nazis ordered Danish Jews to wear yellow stars, the king reportedly said he would wear one himself. Whether this story is literally true matters less than what happened next. Danish citizens engaged in mass civil disobedience, hiding Jews, smuggling them to Sweden, refusing cooperation with Nazi authorities. As a result, Denmark saved approximately 90% of its Jewish population. What made Denmark different? Not superior moral character, but a different collective choice. Individuals decided that protection of their neighbors mattered more than personal safety. They recognized their common humanity rather than accepting imposed divisions. They risked consequences to honor their values. Evil is not inevitable. It requires our cooperation. When we refuse to cooperate, its power diminishes. Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz and wrote that even in the death camps, some prisoners maintained their dignity, shared their last bread, offered comfort to others. He concluded that everything can be taken from a person except the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Even in hell, some chose goodness. We turn evil when we surrender our humanity to ideology, to authority, to the collective. We turn evil when we dehumanize others, when we rationalize cruelty, when we tell ourselves that the ends justify the means. We turn evil when we refuse to think, to question, to take responsibility for our own choices. But we can also choose otherwise. We can acknowledge our shadow and integrate it consciously. We can resist the seductions of tribalism and ideology. We can maintain our capacity for empathy even when systems demand its suppression. We can refuse to cooperate with evil even when cooperation is easy and resistance is dangerous. The potential for evil lives in every human heart. So does the potential for courage, for compassion, for conscious choice. Which one manifests depends not on our nature but on our decisions made daily in small moments and large crises. We are not condemned to evil. We are condemned to freedom and with it to responsibility.